We are now well into election season in America, and the presidential debates keep shape-shifting the story. Debate number 2, what got said and what did not. How online influencers in the U.S. have been influenced by money coming out of Moscow. Plus, Cobalt, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the price that miners are paying to make our mobile phones and laptops. American voters have already had 2 presidential debates to take in ahead of November's election. The first, back in June, was a game changer, knocking Joe Biden off the Democratic ticket. The second, held this past week, may prove to be. Kamala Harris provides the Democrats with a fresh face to put up against Donald Trump, and the skills she acquired as a prosecutor served her well in this debate, in making the case that Trump is unfit to lead. Harris is still carrying the political baggage of the Biden administration on issues such as the economy, immigration, and Biden's refusal to stop Israel on its genocidal mission in Gaza. That may be why Harris has steered clear of journalists, refusing, for the most part, to do interviews with mainstream news outlets. According to the polls, her strategy, prioritizing social media, style, and vibes over substance, seems to be working. And the fact that Donald Trump is 78 years old and is now up against a much younger candidate does not help his cause. A U.S. presidential debate tends to be about more than just a war of words. The optics matter too, the nonverbal forms of communication. Everything from the handshake at the outset to the look one candidate gives the other can send a message, pack a punch.
She walked over to Trump and sort of got in his space, really asserted her dominance early on, and that was a really important move even before the debate had begun.
So any woman in professional life, especially in male-dominated fields like politics, knows the importance of keeping composed even as you're hearing things that are odd or maybe even offensive. And one of the things that I think the split screen was able to do was to show Harris looking really composed. She was looking right at Trump and she wasn't going to let up. And I think part of the strategy wasn't really about him at all. It was about, I can hold the stage, I can be presidential, I can be commander-in-chief.
We know that a tactic of the Harris campaign is to really try and get under the former president's skin, and I think she conveyed that really effectively, just purely with her face, without disobeying any of the rules agreed by the moderators and the candidates in advance.
Another tactic of the Harris campaign is to give the mainstream media the cold shoulder, keeping interviews with legacy news outlets to an absolute minimum. Since being handed the torch by Joe Biden, Harris has done one interview with CNN.
Madam Vice President, Governor Walz, thank you so much for sitting down with me and bringing the book.
Her team prefers to sacrifice the sound bites such interviews produce that play well with older audiences for memes on social media aimed at younger voters, focusing on content that's light on policy but big on vibes, and which the campaign can control, like this ad featuring former members of Team Trump who have defected.
Take it from the people who knew him best. Donald Trump is a danger to our troops and our democracy.
For Kamala Harris, avoiding the likes of Fox News is a no-brainer.
And Kamala Harris is running a very different campaign. She's intentionally laying low.
But her campaign cannot even see an upside to sitting down with the New York Times or calling in to MSNBC.
When you sit down with a reporter, you know that that reporter is going to challenge you if you say something that's false or if you say something that's absurd. When you're putting your own messaging out, you don't have that challenge. And that then feeds into this sort of siloing of the two sides in our politics. And so we've got a challenge in America, rooted in the weakening of a lot of our traditional media outlets and the failure of new media to fill the void. The end result is not good for our politics. Candidates should sit down for interviews.
If Harris has concerns about meeting with the US political press, I think she's giving them a little too much credit. The establishment media here is reliably mealy-mouthed and hasn't been pushing either candidate on the key domestic and certainly geopolitical issues that really affect this country and its role in the world today. That said, would-be president shying away from press scrutiny doesn't look good.
This is a deliberate media strategy that those types of media aren't that important in this modern media environment. If the momentum's with her, why not keep riding that momentum? And we've really seen the Harris campaign lean into social media, lean into memes, into a lot of alternative media, rather than with the major networks, based on the decision that those aren't that important for voters. The test will obviously be in November. It is the strategy that is behind this decision.
Vice President Kamala
The two ABC moderators did not question Harris on her refusal to do more interviews. Far more glaring, though, was the cursory treatment given to Israel's war on Palestine, the crimes against humanity taking place in Gaza and the West Bank, that hundreds of thousands of American students have protested over. The debate lasted 90 minutes. Only 4 minutes was devoted to the war. When Donald Trump did his thing, ranting about Kamala Harris hating Israel and Arab populations, the ABC moderator sought clarification about the Israel part.
That's absolutely not true. I have my entire career and life supported Israel and the Israel.
ABC spent more than twice as much time, 9 minutes, running commercials, peddling its new programming schedule to Americans, than it did examining a genocide being inflicted on Palestinians that the Biden administration is arming and backing. Does the mainstream media anywhere get more corporate than that?
The exchange on Gaza was the low point of the debate. It was disappointing in every sense. It was as if the moderators felt they had to ask a question about Gaza, or at least about Israel-Palestine, but they didn't really want to spend a lot of time on it. They basically set the candidates up to give the answers that they usually give, a repetition of talking points. In a sense, they were making sure that no one would criticize them for not bringing up Gaza, but they really didn't bring up Gaza in a way where you had a serious, thoughtful conversation.
There was no one on that stage, be it Trump, Harris, or the moderators, who showed any interest in holding Israel accountable for the ongoing genocidal war in Gaza. Trump, of course, rabidly Islamophobic, pro-Israel, pro-its ethno-state regime status, and more interested in flattening Gaza and probably turning it into some Dubai-style playground. Harris's gestures towards Palestinian dignity were empty and thus no better. Had the moderators pushed either candidate on the issue, would it have made any difference to the Palestinians being slaughtered in Gaza and now the West Bank? No, because both candidates are fully signed up to supporting Israel's genocide.
The morning after the debate, with pollsters and pundits agreeing that Harris had won the night, Donald Trump was predictably aggrieved. He said ABC's moderators were biased, that they proved it by fact-checking him far more often than his opponent, and that the network should have its license to broadcast rescinded. The former president's reaction was not just familiar. It could have been scripted by the writers of a new feature film about Trump, set for release in the U.S. next month. The Apprentice tells the story of a young Trump and the notoriously cutthroat lawyer who mentored him, Roy Cohn. In it, Cohn schools Trump on the ways of the New York business world, rules that Trump seems to be following to this day in the world of politics.
The first rule is the simplest: attack, attack, attack.
She goes down as the worst vice president in the history of our country.
Rule 2, admit nothing, deny everything.
I don't know anything about it. I don't want to know anything about it.
Rule 3, no matter what happens, you claim victory and never admit defeat.
This was my best debate. I thought it was very good.
Another thing that will have not sat well with Donald Trump on the morning after, ABC's moderators were getting better reviews than he was.
I think the moderators did what was necessary and what's been missing in the presidential debates thus far. So, for example, Donald Trump spouted a kind of wild conspiracy theory about Haitian immigrants.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there.
There's no evidence of this claim. It's a far-right concoction, and one of the moderators, David Muir, stepped in.
There have been no credible reports of specific claims of pets being harmed, injured, or abused by individuals within the immigrant community.
This kind of intervention is important when we're thinking about things that have no factual basis whatsoever and have real implications for the safety of people. The moderators ensured there was a baseline of truth and fact in this debate.
There were some things Harris said as well. So both of these candidates, they're politicians, they're competing and they're saying things that may be over the top, but proportionally, the number of lies and the number of just completely absurd statements from Donald Trump just dwarfed the number that came from Kamala Harris. And so I think that the moderators, when they challenged Donald Trump on things he had said, I think that was appropriate. To my mind, they should have done a lot more.
The value of most political debates is that they take candidates away from their standard campaign stops, where they have the stage to themselves, to one they have to share, allowing voters to compare. This one was different. The comparison Americans were making this week, consciously or subconsciously, was of these two images, the choice they were offered in the first debate versus the one they have now. And on that, the optics, it was no contest from the very start. Staying with the U.S. for now, Washington says it is conducting a coordinated effort against foreign influence in this election. Meenakshi Ravi has been following this story.
There has been all kinds of activity in D.C. over Russian disinformation operations tied not just to the presidential elections, but congressional elections too. 3 government departments combined to bust 2 programs, one called Doppelganger and the other involving online influencers. Doppelganger, quote, disseminates disinformation through a network of cloned websites, fake articles, and social media manipulation. The pro-Russian narratives on those sites included negative depictions of Ukraine and posts about contentious social issues in the United States. The other scheme involved some high-profile right-wing influencers, names like Dave Rubin, Benny Johnson, and Tim Pool, who have followers in the millions. Washington accuses 2 US-based employees of Russian state media outlet RT of funneling $10 million to a US social media company called Tenet, which paid those influencers for their videos.
Ukraine is the enemy of this country. Ukraine is our enemy, being funded by the Democrats.
There's a twist in this story. The influencers involved say that they were among the victims since they weren't informed of the original source of the money. They also said they had full editorial control of all their content. In Moscow, Washington's anti-disinformation drive has caused amusement. RT's deputy editor-in-chief wrote, "There are 3 certainties in life: death, taxes, and RT's interference in the American elections." There are flaws in this US government campaign because it only goes so far. 3 months ago, Israel was revealed to have organized and paid for an influence campaign that used fake profiles on X, Facebook, and Instagram to post pro-Israel comments. Israel pumped $2 million into that. The outcry? There wasn't one.
Thanks, Meena. Cobalt is one of the most in-demand minerals in the world today. It is used in the batteries of our smartphones, laptops, and electric cars. Most of the global supply of cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, either through big industrial mines or an unregulated sector known as artisanal mines. However, covering cobalt extraction in the DRC is notoriously difficult, which makes it hard to know what kind of conditions the miners are working under. From the limited coverage that is produced, we hear stories of child labor, hazardous mines, and exploitation. Terms like blood cobalt get bandied around, along with comparisons to the Congo's violent colonial past, all of which is contested by the mining and big tech companies that profit from cobalt. They maintain that their supply chains are ethical. In the first of a 2-part report, the Listening Post's Nick Muirhead went to the DRC to try to get access to the mines to see for himself what the story is.
Who wields the truth? The marketing teams at tech and EV companies wield the truth, or is it the Congolese people? Because they're telling completely opposite stories. People on the ground in the Congo are telling a story of pillage, suffering, penny wages, and death to feed cobalt up the chain. The companies at the top of the chain are talking about human rights, zero-tolerance policies on child labor, sustainable mining practices. Please look the other way and upgrade your phone this year. So we have to all think, who do we want to believe?
Once again, the resources of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, are at the center of global demand. First, the world came for its rubber, then its gold, copper, and now cobalt, the mineral used in the batteries that power our modern-day rechargeable lifestyles. The extraction of cobalt is a difficult story to tell, and the limited coverage that does come out paints a grim picture of exploitation and environmental damage. In the eastern region, there is a conflict that has been ongoing since 1996. An estimated 6 million people have been killed, more than 7 million displaced. The fighting is taking place far away from the cobalt mines, but it complicates everything. To show you how tightly controlled the cobalt story is and why, we start in the DRC's largest city. It's bustling, heavily policed, and sometimes volatile. It's the perpetually chaotic capital, Kinshasa. Journalists are accustomed to going through certain hoops to gain access, legal access to a story. But in the DRC, getting close to the mining story is especially arduous. It's taken us 2 months and thousands of dollars to get my visa and press accreditation. And to give you an idea of the bureaucracy we had to navigate, look at all the stamps from the various government bodies that we collected along the way. And despite all of this, we don't have permission to go to the south of the country, where the mines are. That's still a work in progress.
Coverage of cobalt mining in particular is a sensitive issue for a variety of reasons. Obviously, mining in the DRC represents a large share of domestic revenue and of the Congolese economy. They are a fringe of pretty influential Congolese politicians and military elites who have personal stakes in the industry. I also think that the nature of mining and how mining concessions are structured makes it difficult to access and to report.
After getting the last approval that we needed from Kinshasa, we flew to Lubumbashi, the second largest city in the DRC and the gateway to the cobalt mines. The sector is divided in two: regulated industrial mines operated by big mining companies. They use heavy machinery and produce 80% of the DRC's cobalt. The remaining 20% comes from unregulated artisanal mines that are dug manually, which make them much more dangerous. Lubumbashi is also where most of the Congolese journalists who cover the mining sector are based, like Frank Fwamba, the editor of Mining News magazine. What has been your experience covering this sector? As someone that focuses on the mining industry, have there been any challenges or dangers that you've faced while trying to do your job?
Are there any dangers? When you go to the mining site, don't expect to be greeted with cheers. The miners are worried. They want to know who does what and why. So if you're not well supervised, or people aren't prepared for your presence, there may be frustration that leads to poor choices and dangerous situations.
There is some hesitation about confiding or sharing lived experiences with outsiders, in part because of that press. The portrayal of human rights abuses has an impact on the local economy, on foreign investment, which in turn has impact on people's livelihoods.
I would do interviews under the cover of darkness. We'd arrange a safe place with trusted guides, transport villagers before dawn to that site. Then I would do interviews, keep them there for the day, and then return them after sunset. Now, mind you, most people don't want to talk because there's enormous peril associated with revealing the truth.
From Lubumbashi, we catch a bus west to what's known as the cobalt capital of the world, Kolwezi. Around 70% of the global supply of cobalt comes from this small patch of the DRC. As we get closer, the hallmarks of extraction start to present themselves. The road is well traveled, but it's also treacherous. When we reach Kolwezi, we find a town on the edge of an industrial mine where we will have to wait for our final approval to go to the mines. Candy Afime went to Kolwezi in 2022 to document the impact that industrial mining was having on the surrounding communities.
We spoke to over 130 people, met with company officials. What we found is that the communities that really live on or around mineral-rich land are really not the beneficiaries of that activity. Worse, many of them have to live their homes and their farmland forcibly without minimum, safeguards. One of the cases we looked into, the community explained to us that in 2016, their informal settlement was completely erased from the map with the participation of the Congolese military that destroyed their informal settlements, and we were able to corroborate that information through the review of satellite imagery.
The largest cobalt mining concession in the southeastern Congo is the size of London. So you have to imagine a London-sized concession multiplied several times over that's been ripped apart, and all the people who used to live in that concession displaced, pushed to the fringes of existence. Now there's no way for them to survive except to scrounge back into that territory where they used to live and try to fill a sack of cobalt for the day.
These groups of people would move into the artisanal mining sector, and it's known to be a family affair. Typically, the men do the digging, the women wash the cobalt, and the children have been known to work as well. But many have to go with their parents to the mines because even though they can be deadly for poverty-stricken families, that's the only option.
There are plenty of dangers in artisanal mining. The material is radioactive, and very often the miners work without protective clothing or equipment. No gloves, no masks, no glasses. They expose themselves to harm because raw cobalt is toxic. It leads to disease and birth defects.
A family unit will work 12 hours in hazardous, toxic conditions to fill up 1 or 2 sacks, which they will sell to the industrial mining company for the equivalent of $1 or $2 of income a day. And if they suffer a shattered leg, a broken neck, or God forbid they are buried alive in a tunnel collapse, they'll just bring in the next family. And that's how this fever, this scramble for cobalt is being met.
You have to get your heads around this. Artisanal workers are not state employees. They are part of cooperatives. We realized that at one point the cooperative managers did not have protective equipment for workers. We realized that they weren't trained in the correct digging and operating procedures. We are talking about landslides happening when things are poorly done. But many of the mining companies don't cooperate with journalists because when we cover this sector, there are hard questions that need to be answered.
In part 2 of this report, we finally managed to get inside a cobalt mine. We analyzed some of the news coverage that has been produced about these issues over the years to try and assess whether or not it gives an accurate portrayal of what is happening. And we look at cobalt supply chains, which big tech companies claim are ethical, but a growing number of journalists, researchers, and activists say otherwise.
And finally, this past week, an Israeli military plane flew over a refugee camp in Gaza, an area that Israel had designated a safe zone, and dropped a 2,000-pound bomb on it. Rescuers and eyewitnesses in Al-Mawasi described a hellish scene. A crater 9 meters deep, people buried in the sand, killed as they slept, entire families erased. After 11 months of broadcasting their horror stories, Palestinians are right to wonder if the world has grown desensitized to their mass killing. The huge gap between the reality of trying to survive a genocide and the way their story gets reported, the excuses made, the euphemisms used, when a word like genocide will do. We cannot stop talking about it and reporting on it because there is just no normalizing this. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.